So I fully realize, if I just unplug that. Yeah. Oh. Last night, Bishop Conley was saying, I think it was Bishop Conley was saying we shouldn't be Luddites. And I don't know why shouldn't we. This is an example of why we should be Luddites. So I'm taller than the other speakers. I can stoop. John cut it back, and I will. That's fine. Thank you. Yeah, we're good. So it is somewhat embarrassing to be here. I truly feel embarrassed to be here. I think the first time where I've gone to a conference where the majority of the speakers are friends, and every time I turn around, there are former students. And I'm a Yankee, an Irish Catholic, and so I'm driven by feelings of guilt. And this is so much fun, I'm almost at a loss to how to think or behave. In November of 1990, I began this strange journey within Kansas. So in 1990, I was in Scotland, and I met someone that a number of you know, named Robert Wire. And I learned how to read from Robert Wire. And through Robert and Laura Wire, was introduced to Howard Clark, all the people at St. Greg's, Funkambo, Clear Creek, of which I'm now an oblate. And I've had the opportunity to come out now several times to the various communities that are in this part of the world, and it's extraordinarily rich. And I have no doubt that one day chapters in church history and in American history can be written about the things that happened in Oklahoma and Kansas. And I'm honored to be sort of walking through a few pages. When I'm invited to speak, I actually write the talks and then they disappear. And so the virtue of that is you get a talk, it's your gift, audience, I hope you like it. It's not going to be reused. The flaw in that is that I just write it. So I wrote 8,000 words. So if you give talks, 8,000 words is about an hour and a half to an hour and 45 minutes. I was told by many of my friends, too long. So I got up early this morning and pared it down. So if it seems that it's choppy, I apologize. It's because I've had to drop portions of the talk out because I know that I stand between you and lunch. So let's get started. May God Almighty pardon you, sister. What have you done? Today is the feast of Saint Scholastica, about whom St. Gregory the Great preserves a remarkable story. Toward the end of both their lives, St. Benedict and his sister Scholastica traveled to meet and pray and converse. It is a remarkable moment in their lives, one pregnant with meaning for us. In what we may consider a kind of biography of St. Benedict, written by Gregory the Great, Gregory introduces the episode as a way of answering a question posed by one of his friends and students. That question was, are the saints able to do everything they wish, and do they obtain all they desire? Benedict and Scholastica had spent a rich and wonderful day together, but as the sun set, Benedict became rather scrupulous about the observation of his own monastic rule. He comes across in that episode as distracted, even a little depressed or angry. His sister implored him to stay, pray more, and converse more. It's very hard to know exactly what was in Benedict's heart at that moment. He simply retreated behind a rule and expressed his inability to do anything about the situation. Scholastica folded her hands, placed her head down on the table before her, and prayed to God, imploring him to intervene. And as she raised her head, a torrential downpour began and continued the whole evening. And so Benedict was stuck. And his sister stayed, and they prayed together, and they spent the whole night in prayer and in conversation. Gregory makes it very clear that Benedict had forgotten something. He had forgotten that love is an active power, and that God demands holy and creative activity, not a passive hiding behind customs, especially those of our own creation. St. Benedict had his passivity washed away by his sister's example. Benedict's vision of God's reality was so restored that 3 days later he saw with the inner eye of his soul, the soul of his sister rising up to heaven, like a snow-white dove rising into the hidden recesses of the skies. Now, I've been invited to speak to you today on education. I am a Benedictine oblate, and the Rule of St. Benedict, which I try to read through 3 times a year, I can tell you, has very little to say directly about schools or education. It does envision that the life proposed in the rule will have a school supporting it. But the word school is used once and in a very strange way. Benedict says of his project, quote, "We must establish a school of the Lord's service, in Latin, constituenda est ergo nobis Dominici Schola Servitii." Schola Servitii, a school of service. If you know a little Latin and a little history, this is a very intriguing and enjoyable, oh, there are people up there. Hello. Schola Servitii is an intriguing pairing of 2 words. To the Romans and Greeks, schola, from which comes our idea and our word school, means a place of leisurely study, of play or exercise and conversation. Schola marks a place which reflects the condition of a free man. Servitium, on the other hand, communicates raw, profane, sweaty labor, the condition of a slave. So what a strange paradox, to unite the condition of one who has total freedom and peace to the condition of one beset by the weight of hard work, usually for the advantage of others. In my talk, I'm going to suggest that for Christian education to be truly Christian, for young boys, girls, men, and women to flourish, we need to rediscover the secret of this union of schola, a free man's leisure, and servitium, hard manual work. The secret of that union lies in the fact that such a union is of the Lord's, the school of the Lord's service. I've been watching the audience in the earlier talks, and you have remarkable attention and focus. But I'm still a firm believer that most people trail off after about 10 or 15 minutes. So every time I speak, I try at the beginning to give the whole talk, and then you can trail off and sleep. So here's what I'm going to say for the whole talk, in a nutshell. First, I'll ask you to consider with me one of the greatest crises of our civilization, the current crisis in manhood, which is part of a deeper crisis related to the very meaning of our humanity. That'll be easy, right? We'll handle that in about 10 minutes. Actually, that one will be compressed quite a bit because a number of our speakers have already begun to address this. Second, we'll turn to a century or so of the American past to observe how this crisis really isn't new, and that sensible and good-hearted men and women have tried to face it, and yet they failed. It's important to observe their endeavors. The third part of my talk will argue that the failure to deal with the crisis of manhood was inevitable in these earlier attempts, because these attempts didn't anchor their projects in any proper understanding of man, which requires an understanding and acceptance of Christ. If this anthropology, understanding man by understanding Christ, is in place, if the encounter with and the imitation of Christ remains at the heart of a community and its efforts, that community's educational efforts will always include manual craftsmanship. In short, part one of my talk is an overview of glaringly bad things. That's the part of the talk we all enjoy hearing, but I'm just going to race through that because we already know it. The second part examines 19th and 20th century efforts at dealing with cultural decline by encouraging noble manliness, especially in the woodcraft movement, which flowered in the Boy Scouts and in shop classes. And the third part will suggest that when we understand our humanity correctly, particularly when men understand their manhood through the person of Christ, we will work, especially through craftsmanship and manual work, within our schools and throughout our adult lives, and that this will play a critical part in restoring, maintaining, and building Christian culture. That was too taxing. Here it is in a sentence. An authentic Christian education will include manual labor and craftsmanship. Go get a taco. Have a burger. So the crisis, the first part. I have loads of statistics. They're depressing. We can talk about this tonight over bourbon if you want to. But let's have a story instead. When I began full-time teaching with Robert Wire, actually, in Milwaukee, or near Milwaukee, I was faced with a very dreadful moment as a young new teacher, the parent-teacher conference. Now, I was at a very, very good preparatory school in the Midwest. Most of the teachers there were practicing Christians. They were trying to be virtuous. They loved teaching. I had a number of students, but I'll tell you about one young man, freshman, let's call him James. James was always in trouble. He fought, his language was sloppy in every sense of that word, and sometimes foul. He couldn't sit still for a few minutes, and I don't mean like all boys have trouble sitting still for more than a few minutes. His handwriting was absolutely appalling. He was missing half of his assignments, and he was failing my history class, so I had an obligation to meet with his parents. At the meeting, the parents expressed their frustration with James' performance and his grades. And when I asked about study habits in the household and things like television, diet, I got the description that I feared. The household was disordered, absolutely disordered, not simply James's life, but the parents'. There's no schedule, there's no consequences for poor behavior. Everyone loved one another. They're very friendly, they wanted the best for one another. They just couldn't figure out how to help James or themselves. Now again, James wasn't wild, didn't argue with anyone. He was distracted. His energy moved in wild booms and busts. I learned another thing from his parents, and that was they had taken him to a psychologist, and the psychologist, who also had children at the school, the psychologist was recommending medication. It's one of the first of many students that I've met, increasing numbers, who are told their problems can be solved by medication. I asked the parents a question, not from anything particularly firm in my mind, more really just because I was uncomfortable being a validator with James being put on prescription drugs. I asked, was there anything that ever revealed that he was capable of attentiveness and being calm? And both the parents immediately said, yes, there was. He likes to fish with his grandfather. I then asked if the grandfather could come in. We'll have a grandfather-teacher conference. And the grandfather came in a few days later. A number of years earlier, James's grandfather had taken him out on a flatboat for some very simple freshwater fishing on the lake. He taught him how to use a spinning reel, a little bit about bait, a little bit about the behavior of fish, not much, thought the grandfather. Now the grandfather was a passionate angler. He especially liked fly fishing. I asked him what James was like on the occasions, and there were very few, what James was like on the occasions when they went out. The answer, universally calm, attentive to both the art of fishing and getting that fish, happy even if he didn't get the fish. He'd be quiet for long periods of time, then he would engage his grandfather about fish, and then about all of nature, and then about them. I then asked the grandfather if he thought he had time to fish on a weekly basis with James. And he was semi-retired, he thought he might. Then I went to the principal and said, can we get release time? Can we be creative on this kid's the structure of his week? Because I want to help him out. And the principal said, sure, what are you thinking? And I said, I want to have him go home early to go fishing. I've always been a maverick in education. So he came up with a schedule. It wasn't quite as open as I had hoped. But James went out and he started fishing a lot more. And suddenly, this young man sort of turned into a naturalist. He was interested in river ecology. He was interested in anything that had to do with bass. He would spend evenings making dry flies over at his grandfather's house. And he started liking camping. He found out that the Romans fished. And he thought, Fahey's not so bad. He teaches ancient history. He teaches about Romans. The Romans fished. Maybe there's something to learn in history. He didn't end up becoming a Rhodes Scholar. He's not on the cover, never made the cover of American Angler or anything like that. But he graduated. And he never had to go on any kinds of medication at all. By the way, I'm not against all medication. Some people need medication. I recognize that. I think we're doping the majority of our youth, and they don't need it. They need fishing. There's thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands, I think there are millions of Jameses and Janices, whatever we want to call the female version in this country. They're agitated, then they're bored. They're habituated, especially the men, are habituated into passivity, then they become angry, self-destructive, depressed, and then passive again. And finally, they become very resigned and empty. Now, James's story had a happy ending, but it marked the beginning for me observing that things are not happy for many young people, especially men. Now, it was not, and this needs to be noted, it was not James's father who taught him how to fish. James is the casualty of a long trend, a very long trend, of men abandoning the traditional arts and practices that have been around since time immemorial, especially those that are associated with manhood. And more than abandoning the arts, even when they might keep up the art a little bit, they have absolutely abandoned the idea of tradition, the idea of handing those arts down. The part of the paper that I'm going to skip is largely statistical evidence for depression, antisocial behavior, what a disaster men are, the alleged successes of women and what a disaster they're becoming, and the free fall of just about anything you could call a traditional art, unless you measure it by money, which is how we typically measure these things now. So when we talk about how much money the, quote, hunting industry is making, that's growing. Or the sales of Cabela, that stuff is growing. When you look at hunting licenses, the median age of hunters, when you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics information about exercise and activity, it's all in an absolute free fall. I typically don't like data, but I'm Irish and the Irish like digging, so I view data as something to dig around in to discover something firm. And the data, which most Americans love, points in one direction, really towards complete collapse of anything remotely traditional. Now, I had this awful feeling from the moment I got off the plane in Kansas City, and for the day and a half I was driving around, why am I giving this talk in Kansas? This is like one of the few places where men actually stand up, they look like men, they still hunt, they do. There seems to be a determining number, even if it isn't a majority, that aren't like the data. But I suspect, and from what little I've heard in conversation, that even here, relative to this area, you're not free. Everything is in a state of decline, if not complete collapse. The thrust of my talk, ladies, is really going to be pointing at the men. And no discourtesy, it's just I think we have a responsibility to get our act together, and that many of the problems of humanity and communities, society, the nation in general, start with men. The problem besetting us, especially men, is an old problem. The problem of a lack of purpose, the loss of traditional skills, anemic moral principles. This sense of decline was discussed with increasing concern in the 19th century, as the previous speaker, also from New England, told us. It's common in Europe and America in the 19th century to talk about the decline of tradition, the loss of skills, moral collapse. It's interesting to note that in the mid to late 19th century, when this became intense, that this was also viewed at the time as a place when the roles of women were changing in the home, in education, in the trades, in political life. Starting in the 1880s, there was a sense, especially among the educated, that the social order was completely breaking apart, that civilized man was enervated. Both men and women were becoming more and more emotionally distraught. One of the most systematic responses to this malaise was the scouting movement, most commonly associated internationally with Robert Baden-Powell. The scouting movement itself was an outgrowth of the phenomenon of self-help books that came in the wake of the Industrial Revolution in reaction to the perceived loss of traditional skills. The cookbook originates in this period. The cookbook is a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, the realization, boy, the food really stinks at home. Something's happened. No one seems to know how to cook or keep a larder or a good pantry. Back to Scouts. The foremost influence on Baden-Powell, and one of the chief architects of the American Boy Scouts, was a man named Ernest Thompson Seton. Seton had published 25 books between 1886 and 1908, the year Baden-Powell wrote Scouting for Boys and launched the official Boy Scouts movement. For Baden-Powell, an Englishman, Seton, who was born in England, moved to Canada, and then became American, Seton may have been the single greatest literary partner and inspiration for the Scouting movement. Seton's concerns, objectives, and methods are set out strongly in the opening chapter of the Book of Woodcraft and Indian Lore. And this became a kind of manifesto which he wrote for his movement called the Woodcraft Indians movement, and then a lot of this, in fact, this very manifesto was then put in as the first chapter of many of the early editions of the Boy Scout Manual as a constitution or a declaration of purpose. So here's the opening. This is Seton. This is a time when the whole nation is turning toward outdoor life, seeking it in the physical regeneration so needful for continued national existence. The whole nation is wakening to the fact, long ago known to thoughtful men, that those live longest who live nearest the ground, that is, who live the simple life of primitive times, divested, however, of the evils of the ignorance that begot those times. Consumption, the white man's plague since he has become a house race, is vanquished by the sun and air, and many ills of the mind also are forgotten when the sufferer boldly takes to a life intense. Intense, not intense, but intense. The wilderness affords the ideal camping, but many of the benefits can be got by living in a tent pitched on town lots, in a piazza, or even on a housetop. I should like to lead this whole nation into the way of living outdoors, for at least a month each year, reviving and expanding a custom that goes as far back as Moses was, reviving and expanding a custom that, as far back as Moses, was deemed essential to the national well-being. That's the end of the quotation. This manifesto, as I said, was placed at the beginning of the Boy Scouts handbooks from 1911 on for a number of years. For Seton, the Indian of North America, or the Spartans of the West, as he called them, held the model life that would lead to social and physical renewal. And while his course of study in the Woodcraft program made good use of modern natural history and medical practices, it was emphatically inspired and modeled on the rugged Indian life. While following much of Seton, Baden-Powell was decidedly more Christian and oriented purposely towards Western civilization. He added to Seton's general concerns a fear that the British Empire, or at least its culture, was threatened by moral softness, lack of physical endurance, and ignorance of outdoor and emergency skills. His vision of an international scouting movement was decidedly religious and communal, looking simultaneously to indigenous peoples of the British Empire, especially as they would appear in a Kipling novel, and to the Knights of the Round Table, or the Crusaders, or Elizabethan explorers. For Baden-Powell, the principles of scouting were contained in his original three-part oath. One, to be loyal to God and the King. Second, to help other people at all times. Third, to obey the scout law. Baden-Powell's vision was clearly the dominant of the two, and anyone who can recall any version of the American scout law can attest that there was a blending of the spirit of the medieval knight with the Indian brave in a manner that's still very attractive, I think, to many readers. The scouting movement is certainly, in my view, a contender for the best social movement for encouraging the maturation of young men as men, for the acquisition of useful and traditional handcraft skills, and for learning how to accept, if not seek out, physical challenges so as to grow in virtue. At its founding, it was understood to be patriotic, social, religious, although strictly non-sectarian. The religious orientation of a scout troop was determined by the local units. Most of you know, and I'll skip this part, that the scouts are in an absolute freefall. Most people will pin that on maybe the last 10 or 15 years. I think it goes back much further. I think when the scouts allowed scouts who were atheists in 1920 to join, something significant changed. The revolution regarding membership and core principles in the Scouts, if you know anything about what's going on now, is tragic for those who admire the traditional scouting movement. But as I say, that revolution was long in the making, and I don't think it could have been avoided. For the Scouts, very early on, within a few years of founding, had introduced problematic guidelines and ideas that would undermine the whole of Baden-Powell's vision. And this is important for us if we're trying to think through how to address similar problems. And if you have an inclination that the agrarian life, handcrafts, work, building community, men singing songs, if you think all that's good, if you're attracted to that, you need to study the Boy Scouts. Why did they fail? If you believe that the Boy Scouts failed because wicked feminists very recently chipped away at them, you need to look more deeply into flaws within their own principles, very close to the founding itself. Baden-Powell's original handbook provided suggestions for a rigorous outdoor program, where the emphasis was on woodland, and woodcraft, and emergency skills, tracking, botany, camp life. The 1911 handbook, one of the earliest ones, had only a very small number of badges. I think there were 7. and they were almost entirely ambulance skills, pioneering outdoor work. My favorite one is the Master at Arms badge. Here's the entire description that gives you a sense of the early scouts. Master at Arms badge, quote, proficiency in 3 out of 6 subjects. Single stick fighting, jiu-jitsu, boxing, wrestling, quarterstaff, or fencing, unquote. The majority of the activities of the Scouts revolved around maturation within a male society and learning rigorous and seriously scrutinized traditional craftsmanship. Very soon came in a complex path of honors and recognitions. During the First World War, Star and Life Scout were introduced. The Eagle Scout and the different merit badges began to grow. Now for an Eagle Scout, there was the classic 21 as the number of badges you needed to acquire. And early on, originally, the majority of those were specified, and they largely revolved around difficult outdoor and traditional craftsmanship, camping, blacksmithing, archery, agriculture, seamanship. The handful that weren't rugged, outdoors, traditional were still traditional and required an apprenticeship-master relationship, like sculpture. Quickly, the Boy Scouts hit about 50 badges, and then by the 1940s, 100 badges. In the 1940s, the physical and skill-based requirements of the Scouts were lowered, and the purpose of scouting began to shift. Increasingly from the 1940s, the language changes entirely. If you collect Scout manuals and go read them, check this out. The early handbooks are addressed to the Scoutmaster. He's a master. The boys need to learn something. In the 1940s, the books are addressed to the boys. The language is all about you. It still has Indians, it still has many of the great things there, and the Scouts are still great, and probably some units are still fantastic. But there's a fundamental shift in the language. And you change the language, and that's a sign that either the ideas had already changed, or there's something going on. The dominant theme from the 1940s is about how much fun you're going to have. Fun shows up all the time from the 40s on. Fun and the perpetual you. There's an explosion of merit badges that took on a decidedly academic quality. The badges were less about skills and mastery and more about study. By the 1980s, the common outdoor and skill-based requirements of the Eagle Scouts had dwindled to 3 out of 21. So that an Eagle Scout, once considered a forerunner of an Army Ranger or Marine, could now fulfill the majority of the Eagle Scout, the elite of the Boy Scouts, could fulfill the majority of requirements with subjects like chemistry, computers, reading, pulp and paper, handicap awareness, genealogy, consumer buying, food systems, fingerprinting, coin collecting, etc. The emphasis became, and very much remains, that the merit badge is about learning how to prepare reports. The boy's no longer subjecting himself to a traditional discipline in the language of the guides or the goals, no longer apprenticing himself to a superior, no longer judged by canonical standards. Instead, he's an independent agent, collecting data, preparing display boards, writing histories, setting down definitions, processing data. Rather than chiefly being concerned with reality in the things he makes, reality in nature, he's been driven deeper into his mind and into his self. Now, while there's still a handful of manual arts and many outdoor sports, many in the Boy Scouts, and many boys simply elect to choose those, but they're electives. There's not a core like there used to be. One really does wonder, if you go through the literature, as badges like graphic design and digital technology continue to emerge, how much longer is welding going to last, or surveying? There are currently 135 badges to choose from. With that number, what's going on with the discontinuation of so many badges? Here's some that have been discontinued. The Master of Arms, blacksmithing, cement work, botany, stalking, handcraft, machinery, masonry, pathfinding, pigeon raising, rabbit raising, wood turning, bookbinding, beekeeping. Those are the casualties, but we're up to 135. Now, I don't mean to be harsh, but do we really think that many within the Boy Scouts of America have been serious about formation and mentorship of young men, as men, when included in merit badges? Here's my favorite, collection. Does anyone know what the collection merit badge is? You write a report about your collection of Pez candy dispensers and old toys and army men. That's merit. Consider the difference between the old firemanship and the new fire safety. Firemanship required the ability of a young man to communicate with the civil authorities about the location, source, and course of a fire, the ability to enter and clear a burning building, to prevent panic and bring order to crowds, to understand the practice and uses of various hoses and hydrants, understand evacuation techniques and equipment to be used, to be tested in the building of improvised ropes and ladders, to be tested in the evacuation of buildings, to be tested on his own strength to carry an individual and a fireman carry under pressure, knowledge of how to organize a bucket brigade, a demonstration of a bucket brigade, how to determine the viability of saving animals in a fire and private property, and the capacity to assist the police and other emergency services. Here's the badge that replaced it. Fire safety involves going to visit a fire station. Demonstrating, there is still some ability you have to demonstrate. You have to demonstrate the ability to light a match, arrange briquettes in a barbecue, and light a candle. You have to memorize a host of chemical causes of fires. You have to write a report on the dangers and social costs of arson and wilderness fires. And in general, you have to learn how to avoid fire. Fire remains in both the old and the new badge, but craftsmanship is present in only one. One is ordered towards action and service. The other one is ordered towards caution and risk avoidance. Again, we can argue about the merits of young men acting as the local fire brigade, or the likelihood in 2018 that scouts would be respected by a mob in an urban disaster. But the shift in emphasis is telling, and the strange thing is we chuckle because it would probably be a disaster if the Boy Scouts tried to do crowd control. But well into the 50s, that's how it worked. In New England, when the hurricanes hit in the 20th century, from the First World War, every hurricane that hit New England, 1920s into the 60s, private property in neighborhoods that were evacuated were placed under the watch of the Sea Scouts. Sea Scouts went to sea looking for people. They actually did all the work that we assume only the military, only the National Guard can do. This was true of all disasters. Elections, those were overseen by Scouts. Fire, it was actually commonplace for Scouts to help in riot control. Something's changed in a rather short span of time. In the past, Scouts were encouraged to think of themselves as knights in shining armor, 18th century explorers, or simply courteous and well-prepared patriots. Today, they still are in a way. But to quote the official language that I looked at on Thursday in the Boy Scouts of America Merit Badge section, the purpose of the Merit Badge, to show your stuff. The description of showing your stuff is not a junior Achilles out there doing something great. It's about college preparation, resume preparation, preparing reports, moving on. Should we be surprised that the Boy Scouts are in a free fall? The woodcraft movement also inspired, or was part of a general movement to introduce, restore, regularize woodwork, metalwork, and traditional trades in the school system. I went to a public school for part of my life in Northeast Ohio. My children are enraptured at dinner when I tell them about the courses we were required to take. I had to make a bookcase, we had to learn to do dovetail joints, we had to learn how to weld. It was all very simple, but for 4 years, everyone had to learn these basic skills. And you were allowed to advance if you really liked it. That's been obliterated. If you're interested in seeing a parallel obliteration, and I imagine some of you know this book or this author, and if you want to look at what happened to the shop class movement and the arts and crafts movement within our schools, which was enormous. Although by the 1980s, the median age of shop teachers is already in their late 50s. Always a sign that extinction is very close. What happened to it? Why did it disappear? And some of the reasons that it's great, I highly recommend, and I saw that there were at least 3 copies in the back, of Matthew Crawford's book, Shop Class as Soulcraft, where he looks philosophically at what has been lost for the individual, for our nation, by the dismemberment, the scorn directed towards shop and manual crafts. The school I went to was in a place called Hudson, Ohio. Hudson, Ohio is part of the Western Reserve of Ohio. It was founded by, and for a period of time, part of the state of Connecticut. It's one of the wealthiest towns in the United States. It was an excellent school system. Everyone knew how to work a lathe, a table saw. Everyone could spot weld, and it wasn't viewed as special at all. That's no longer in that curriculum. So all over the United States now, it's STEM. What little elective space we allow is driven by science, technology, processing information, and progressive politics. What happened in the schools is very similar to what happened in the Scouts. We've moved away from making, building, and serving humans in a real way to data analysis, self-esteem building, and career preparation. Programs which carry certain physical risks and emphasize craftsmanship and manual competence are absolutely anathema in our society. I think for 5 reasons. We have a society dominated by government and government-like regulation. Independent thought and self-sufficiency are not virtues in the face of government regulation. In an information economy, risk-taking, popular to contrary, exciting rhetoric pushed by the very valiant defenders of the market economy, risk-taking, well, it's risky. And big business, corporations, they don't actually want risk-takers. I don't care what people say in a TED Talk. They don't want it. The business world, the academic world is structured to prevent it. What is needed is a workforce that can do basic things that's largely passive and compliant to support larger, complex technological projects. Third reason, scientific management styles, which dominate the whole country, view it as inefficient for any one worker to control the entire process. A person shouldn't make a bookcase. That's dangerous. It's inefficient and dangerous. It's much better to be on a team. Work on one little part. Our society is largely adverse to the language of objective standards The word standards is out there, they're not objective. Craftsmanship is naughty because it has a couple bad words in there. Craft, man, and I think ship follows it. Mastery, in most healthy ways, that's viewed as a bad word. But we love words like continuous assessment, group sourcing, collaborative learning. And in that kind of environment, it's very hard to even tolerate people who believe that there are non-subjective standards by which something is judged outside of the mind. And now we come to the major issue, the fifth reason. Manual craftsmanship clings firmly to the reality of a world beyond one's mind and beyond one's individual feelings. One can't interpret a bevel. One can't have a political position on a dovetail joint. There's not going to be a debriefing on the clove hitch. There's no opportunities for transgressive creativity, whatever that may be, when it comes to using a table saw. Tomatoes do not grow by, to use my favorite expression from the glossary for the new core test, tomatoes don't grow by weighing knowledge demands. Belief in objective standards, a hierarchy based on expertise, canonical standards of excellence, especially in a field that has a concentration of men, those kind of beliefs, these are ossifications, which the modern educational manager has to scour away. Now, in the Catholic educational tradition, the reasons for excluding manual crafts draw us into a controversial matter, and it has to do with a position on the different kinds of arts. Liberal arts, manual arts, servile arts. And Catholics have basically accepted this. A lot of the damage was done by our obsession with a very strange phenomenon. A handful of people read Dorothy Sayers' okay essay on the lost tools of learning. And everyone suddenly decided that a mystery writer with a dysfunctional family, and in fact, almost no family, was the right person to lay out the educational philosophy of the future. A lot of people have an understanding of the trivium and the quadrivium and what the liberal arts mean, and their separateness from everything else, based on that essay and some similar popular things that appeared at the same time. This is anti-historical hogwash. I mean, I've got a lot of enemies because of this. It may seem strange, but the belief that the liberal arts must be separate from the manual arts. It's hogwash. It's anti-historical, anti-Christian hogwash. And I shouldn't say that because that's a discourtesy to hogs. One would be hard-pressed, I don't want you to believe me on this point. One would be hard-pressed to find a more insightful critique to the restrictive and pagan position of separating the liberal arts from the other arts than the words of Pope Benedict in his address to the representatives of culture in Paris in 2008. After anchoring the origin and nature of European culture in the Christian quest for God, Benedict turned momentarily aside to the place of work. I have a long quotation, and I'll tell you when the quotation ends. This is Benedict. But our considerations would remain incomplete if we did not also at least briefly glance at the second component of monasticism. That's what he's been discussing, and how monasticism created European education and culture. The second component of monasticism, indicated by the word labora. In the Greek world, manual labor was considered something for slaves. Only the wise man, the one who's truly free, devotes himself to the things of the Spirit. He views manual labor as somehow beneath him and leaves it to people who are not suited to this higher existence in the world of the Spirit. So there's Benedict summarizing the Greek notion of the liberal arts. He then continues, the Jewish tradition was quite different. All the great rabbis practiced at the same time some form of handcraft. Paul, who, as a rabbi and then a preacher of the gospel to the Gentile world, was also a tent maker and earned his living with the work of his hands. And he is no exception here, but stands within the common tradition. Monasticism took up this tradition. Manual work is a constitutive element of Christian monasticism and culture. Christians, who thus continued in the tradition previously established by Judaism, must have felt further vindication by Jesus' saying in St. John's Gospel, in defense of his activity on the Sabbath, "My Father is working still, and I am working." The Greco-Roman world did not have a creator God. According to its vision, the highest divinity could not, as it were, dirty his hands in the business of creating matter. The making of the world was left to the demiurge, the lower deity. The Christian God is different. He, the one, real and only God, is the creator. God is working. He is continuing to work in and on human history. In Christ, he enters personally into the laborious work. My Father is working, and I am working. God himself is the creator of the world, and creation is not yet finished. God works. Ergatzetai gives the Greek. Thus, human work was now seen as a special form of human resemblance to God, as a way in which man can and may share in God's activity as creator in the world. End of quotation. Greek understanding of education is related to their theological and spiritual understanding. God doesn't work. God is far removed from the ugliness, mud, sweat, dirt of this world. The gentleman should never sully his hands. The liberal arts, the arts of the free man, must be pure and removed from the manual arts. Benedict points out that the very foundations of Europe, Catholic culture and Catholic education, are contrary to that. Yet how often do we hear and receive catalogs, popular books, that talk about the trivium and the quadrivium, but say nothing, not one word, on our actual tradition. What Pope Benedict teaches us is the fundamental difference in the educational principles between Christian education and any other form of education. But here, he ties it back to the classical Greek tradition. By the way, I'm a classicist. I love and teach. I was the chairman of the classics department. I love the Greeks. The Christian certainly can and does make use of pagan wisdom. He must. Classical literature and philosophy in particular. Yet for the Christian, there's no difficulty in wedding the liberal and the manual arts. Indeed, such a union is the basis of Christian culture and grows out of our understanding of God and our way of imitating Christ. Now, there are many cognitive, developmental, psychological reasons why every person, to the extent that he can, especially when he's young, should be engaged in handcraft, manual work. Work with the hand seems indisputably related to the development of balance, cognitive ability, language. Some would also argue that craftsmanship opens a path to a specific way of knowing reality. That's very different than the analytical knowledge that we're typically taught in schools. And we know ourselves and our world deeply when our hands are involved in creating something, in drawing something from idea into reality that can be touched and felt. Objective standards are even more present when that goes on. We encounter a world, but it's not a world of the projection of our mind. And certainly the slow, painstaking efforts that involves one in craftsmanship, where you're subject under the authority of another person, is excellent for informing in a beautiful way your imagination by sharing in ideas and the life of others, but also protecting you from self-delusion. I think we all have a sense of this. I think most men who have office jobs sit there in a cubicle and they think, I would much rather be arranging briquettes on a charcoal table. There's no amount of email that takes you away from the ordinary, dirty things at home that involve your body and your hands. It's very rare that someone sits at work and doesn't fantasize about these things. I can't think of a man who, when he's barbecuing, fantasizes about being back in the office answering email. We sort of know this in our guts. There's something right about working with our hands. Benedict and John Paul II, in a magnificent encyclical on work, point us to that. They discuss it abundantly if you want to hear more about it. God works with reality, not with abstractions. We must imitate him. I think it's the fear of imitating God, and of course the utter ignorance of God, that leads to the decline of manhood that we see today. Can't have great souls without God, without imitating him, without preparing in our youth for the idea of a vocation, for the idea of work. And we can only prepare by doing it. But I think that terrifies people, and it terrifies them especially if they do not know God, if they do not have an educational system that is focused on God, focused on Christ. Now, the decline of men away from having great souls, or at least participating in a greater sense of purpose as man, that's not new, as I said. In modern society, that was already confronted at least once before with spectacular energy. But the anthropology of what man is for, was flawed in the Boy Scout movement. It was flawed in muscular Christianity. It was flawed in the ideas of Muir and Teddy Roosevelt. Ernest Thompson Seton and others correctly saw that men were enervated, that they lacked courage, that they had only feeble desires for the essential things, and they had a sense that work would help and heal. But Seton and his ilk were much too strongly shaped by the Romantic and Enlightenment philosophy that came from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau thought that civilization was a problem, to boil his ideas down simply. The ancient order of Christendom needed to be viewed with skepticism. Its hierarchy of traditions, that weighed men down, that corrupted men, that kept men from being free from realizing their desires. Rousseau and many other Europeans of the 18th century hankered after primitives in the belief that the closer you were to nature and primitive order, the freer you would be. As a result of such a view, Seton would call men to return to woodcraft, it's true, these manual arts, but he left them at odds with the fact that we live in a complex order of civilization. His imitation of Indians could never rise up above a game. It could never be more than fun. It was part of the same problem. The world is disordered because it's not focused on Christ. No Christ, no man. No Christ, no understanding of work. You can only have an aversion to work without Christ. Now, I began with St. Scholastica and the Benedictines, and so I'll conclude with the Benedictines. St. Benedict's rule, the cornerstone of Western and Catholic monasticism, and as Pope Benedict observed, Christian civilization and education, said little explicit about culture, healthy ecologies, or even schools. The rule does assume there will be a supporting educational program for Christians. And it gives strong hints at what that would look like. But while it doesn't speak very directly on the subject of school, it speaks very directly in chapter 48 on work. Sloth is the enemy of the soul. Therefore, the brethren ought to be employed in manual labor at regular times. The problem experienced in our age by men and women, but so spectacularly by men, is an old, old problem. It is what the fathers of the church, like Benedict, called asadia, or sloth. Now, sloth, traditionally understood, properly understood, is not simply laziness. Sometimes, in fact, often, sloth manifests itself in passivity, swinging into hyperactivity. Sloth manifests itself also in restlessness, in curiosity, in illicit and carnal pleasures. It manifests itself in depression, in an argumentative nature. Sloth is chiefly the despairing of spiritual goods and the avoidance of any difficult thing. Sloth is the enemy of the virtue of magnanimity, great-souledness, a virtue that's avoided, I think in part because it's hard to pronounce. Magnanimity is the quality that marks a man of hope, a man who hardens himself so that he can serve others, obtain spiritual goods, pursue and live out his vocation. The slothful man is antisocial, even when he's hanging out in the crowd. The man of great soul is always looking for opportunities to support others from his own livelihood and his own individual excellence. So if we wish to help boys to mature and grow into men, if we wish to help men to stay mature or to become men, even if they're in their 30s or 40s or 50s or however old, we need to prepare them or begin to school them in the school of the Lord's service. Anyone in that school is going to encounter a strong pull towards lethargy, distraction, hyperactivity. That's going to happen, my understanding from reading the Desert Fathers, until I die. I'm never going to be free of that. And the particulars of sloth may change from age to age, but its basic threat is the same thing. It's the threat to our ability to see that God intends specifically for each and every one of us great things. He wants great things of each and every one of us. Sloth prevents us from seeing that and accepting that as the truth. The way established by our Lord, carpenter and scholar, is a school that of necessity involves real work. If one returns to the sources, we see that our Catholic culture expects all of us to embrace some degree of manual work. How will young men and women do so if they're not taught that they're called to such mastery and self-mastery, and that they'll be judged and evaluated for the craftsmanship of their work and the craftsmanship of their life? They'll be judged objectively. In our fallen state, such work helps to curb vice. But as we experience first wonder and then grace, as we grow in excellence, according to nature and to the Spirit, work, especially manual work, when done well and out of a spirit of service, will play a decisive role leading us out of our self-absorption and into a happiness that we did not expect, but always desired.